thank you so much for coming, and I'll turn this over to Tom McGrath.
So, good afternoon, everyone. As the chairman of the Pepperell Democratic Town Committee, this is truly an amazing crowd here today. And as someone who grew up in Pepperell and a politically active family, active in the Democratic Party politics, this is unprecedented in the history of the Democratic Town. So we doubled the size of our town committee last year, which I'm very grateful for. We actually have subcommittees now, of which one of them is the Speaker's Subcommittee. And the members of that committee have done a great job bringing our guest in today. And we had another speakers event in March, which was very successful. So I'm not going to take up any more time, and April's going to introduce our speakers. So thank you all for being here.
We just have a quick public announcement from Renee about some signatures.
Okay, so I'm Renee D'Argento, and I'm with the Pepperell Democratic Town Committee. I'm actually doing a non-binding ballot question in Sheila and Harrington's district on single-payer health care or Medicare for all healthcare system for Massachusetts. There's some legislation, and we want to ask her, as her constituents, to support it. She likes the idea of single-payer. She doesn't know how it would go, how it would be, the study would be paid for, but we want to just send her a message by having this ballot question, and I hope that you'll help me get it on the ballot by signing my petitions. Thank you. At the end.
I want to personally thank the Speakers Committee. We had a lot of people working on this event today. Tim Brothers, Margaret Scarsdale, Cheryl Rosoff, Renee D'Argento, Tony Beattie, and Marcia Zanavoni. Thank you so much for all the work that you've done. We also have Andover Books store here today with us, which is great. We appreciate them being here with the book. And we have two special people from our town who are officials, Lisa Farrellito and Bill Greathead. So thank you so much for being with us today. And we also have to say happy birthday to Tom McGrath because it's his birthday. So I want to thank you all for being here. This is just, it's great to have people here and to listen to our speaker because his message is really, really important. So let me introduce Dr. Steve Levitsky. He's an American political scientist. He's a professor of government at Harvard University. He was educated at Stanford, where he received his undergraduate degree, and he went to the University of California, Berkeley, where he received his PhD. He serves on executive committees, Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. He taught at Pontifical Catholic University in Peru, and he's written several books, and most recently co-authored the book, How Democracies Die, in 2018. Dr. Levitsky.
First of all, let's cut the Dr. Levitsky crap. Call me Steve. Okay? I barely recognize that when you come in. Thank you so much for for inviting me here and for coming out to hear me. Let me just clarify one thing though. First of all, Pepperell. Is that right? Is that close? Yeah. Okay. Your town is 265 years old. People should be able to pronounce it by now. Daniel Zidlov, my co-author, sends his best. He's in Germany. He would have loved to come up, but he's in Europe right now. So he left his weaker link. So Donald Trump's election raised a question that both Daniel and I thought that we would never ask. Could American democracy actually be in some danger? Like most Americans, like I think the vast majority of Americans, we'd always taken American democracy, always taken the stability of American democracy for granted. And there were pretty good reasons for this. No democracy as old or as rich as the United States has ever broken down. And yet Trump's election seemed to place us in uncharted territory. in his classic book, The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, a Spanish political scientist by the name of Juan Linz devised what he called a litmus test to identify authoritarians before they come to office. And this book was published in 1978. And we kind of took his litmus test and provided kind of a refined version of it in the first chapter of our book. And Donald Trump tests unambiguously positive on this test. He suggested, for example, that he might not abide by the results of the elections during the 2016 campaign. He threatened legal action against critics in the media. He threatened to lock up his opponent, and he condoned and occasionally even encouraged violence. So these were telltale signs, according to half a century ago, Spanish political scientist Juan Linz, of authoritarian behavior. No major party presidential candidate in modern U.S. history had ever behaved in this way. But Daniel and I had seen this kind of behavior before, not in American politics. Trump tests positive on the litmus test. No major American candidate had ever behaved in this way in modern U.S. history. Daniel and I, though, don't study American politics. We had seen this kind of behavior before. Daniel had seen it in his research on interwar Europe back in the 1930s. I'd seen it in my work on Latin America. So during the 2015-16 campaign, as we watched the 2016 presidential campaign unfold, both of us got the feeling that we'd seen this movie before. And it's a movie that usually doesn't end well. So we decided to write a book, trying to draw lessons from other parts of the world, from democracies in crisis elsewhere in the world, and to apply them to the United States. Okay, I want to start off by pointing out that democracies don't die the way they used to die. Democracies used to die almost invariably at the hands of men with guns. During the Cold War in particular, 3 out of 4 democratic breakdowns took place in the form of a military coup. Democracies today die in a more subtle way. They die not at the hands of generals, but at the hands of elected presidents and prime ministers who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. So contemporary democracies die constitutionally, through elections, through referenda, through laws passed by Congress, through Supreme Court rulings. As a result, many citizens are not fully aware that their democracy is sliding into authoritarianism until it is too late. In 2011, 12 years into Hugo Chávez's presidency in Venezuela, a majority of Venezuelans, according to surveys, still believed that they were living under a democracy. The same thing is true today in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey. So if democratic breakdown today begins at the ballot box, one of the keys to protecting it, one of the keys to protecting democracy, is keeping extremists and demagogues from getting elected in the first place, keeping them as far away from power as possible. Here, political parties play an absolutely central role, which is one of the reasons I'm happy to be here at a political party. Parties are democracy's gatekeepers. Because they are the ones who select the candidates for higher office, they have the power to keep extremists and demagogues out. Elected authoritarians rarely come to power on their own. They almost always get a hand, an assist, from mainstream political parties and mainstream politicians. Mainstream parties are very often tempted to strike kind of a Faustian bargain with popular demagogues, aligning with them in the hope of tapping into their popular support and believing that ultimately they can control them. But that bargain very often backfires. In Italy in the 1920s, liberal leader Giovanni Giolitti, seeking to tap into Mussolini's mass appeal, included his fascist party on his liberal party's parliamentary list for elections. That didn't end well. In Weimar Germany, the leader of the Conservative Party in the late 1920s forged an alliance with Hitler, trying to draw on Hitler's grassroots appeal to shore up his own party's declining base. A few years later, in 1933, when conservative leader Franz von Papen tried to ease the concerns of his fellow conservatives after Hitler was named chancellor, told them, don't worry, within 2 months, we'll have pushed him so far into a corner, he will squeal. In both of these cases, in Italy in the 20s, in Germany in the early 30s, mainstream politicians, mainstream political parties, driven by short-term ambitions, abandoned their gatekeeping role and let extremists in the door. In both cases, it turned out to be a tragic miscalculation. Now, historically, American political parties have done a pretty good job of gatekeeping. The United States has no shortage, historically, of extremist demagogues. We've had many of them. Father Coughlin, Henry Ford, Huey Long, Joe McCarthy, George Wallace. Surveys going back to the 1930s, show that each of the figures I just named enjoyed at least 30% approval rating, at least 30% support. That is not very far from Donald Trump's support base. But none of those figures even made it close to the American presidency. How were they kept out? Mostly they were kept out through the candidate selection process. Prior to 1972, as all of you know, American presidential candidates were selected by party leaders through the convention system. And what today we think about as sort of smoke-filled rooms, smoke-filled back rooms. That system, the old convention system, was not very transparent. It wasn't very democratic. It wasn't very inclusive. But it was a pretty effective filtering mechanism. Party leaders, party bosses, served as gatekeepers. They engaged in what political scientists at the time called a process of peer review. Party leaders had worked closely with all of the candidates. They knew their strengths, they knew their weaknesses, they knew how the candidates dealt with stress, with adversity, and they knew which ones of these guys were potential demagogues. And in fact, for all of its shortcomings, and it had many shortcomings, the old convention system had a perfect 100% record in keeping demagogues out. Under the old convention system, it was impossible for a demagogue like Henry Ford to be nominated by a major party for higher office. So most of them, including Henry Ford, who wanted to be president, didn't even try. So what happened in 2016? Two things. First of all, as you know, American parties adopted a system of binding primaries starting in 1972. The primary system is much, much more open, much more inclusive, much more democratic than the old convention system. But it weakened political party leaders' role as gatekeepers. So now, when an outsider, when a demagogue runs for office, for better or worse, it is harder to keep them out. And that's what we saw in 2016. Whereas party gatekeepers once kept demagogues like Henry Ford far from the White House, Trump found the gates wide open. But that's not the whole of the problem. Even after Trump's nomination, even after he won the primaries, Republican gatekeepers failed a second time. Quan Lin, who I mentioned earlier, spent much of his career trying to figure out how and why democracies die. He'd actually been born in Weimar, Germany, grew up during the Spanish Civil War, devoted his career to figuring out why democracies die. One of the key lessons that he drew from his study of the breakdown of democracy in interwar Europe is that mainstream politicians and mainstream parties must do everything possible to keep would-be authoritarians away from the center of power. They must even be willing to join forces with their political rivals. Republicans arguably abdicated that responsibility in 2016. Now, resisting a demagogue, resisting an extremist on your own side, in your own ranks, on your own side of the political spectrum is hard. It risks angering the base, and often it means short-term political defeat. It means you may lose this election. No politician likes to lose an election. So politicians often rationalize. They tell themselves the demagogue might not be so bad, maybe they can control him, and that in any event, as bad as it may be, it's better than handing over power to your political rivals. Again, this is a terrible mistake. Lin's made this point forcefully. When faced with a would-be authoritarian, he wrote, politicians must, and I quote, join with opponents ideologically distant but committed to the survival of the democratic political order. Now, some Republicans did precisely that in 2016. Listen to what 3 Republican politicians said during the 2016 campaign. Republican number 1, our choices this election could not be more clear. Hillary Clinton is a strong and clear supporter of American democracy. Donald Trump is a danger for our democracy. Republican number 2, it's time to put country before party and vote for Secretary Clinton. Trump is too dangerous and too unfit to hold our nation's highest office. Republican number 3. This is serious stuff, and I won't waste my vote on a protest candidate. Since the future of the country may depend on preventing Donald Trump from becoming president, I'm with Clinton this November, and I urge Republicans to join me. Had those 3 statements been made by Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and former President George Bush, or perhaps a trio of prominent senators, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, John McCain, the outcome of the 2016 election would almost certainly have been very different. Alas, the statements were not made by prominent Republicans. They were made by William A. Pierce, former press secretary of retired Maine Senator Olympia Snowe, Jack McGregor, a former state senator from Pennsylvania, and Rick Stoddard, a Republican banker from Denver. Ryan, McConnell, Rubio, and Cruz all endorsed Trump. McCain withdrew his endorsement but refused to endorse Clinton. Bush remained silent. Republican leaders knew that Donald Trump was a demagogue. They knew damn well he was unfit for office. But no major Republican leader was willing to do the one thing that would have ensured Trump's defeat, and that is to endorse Hillary Clinton. Not a single prominent Republican elected official endorsed Clinton. No governors, no senators, one member of Congress, and he was retiring. That sent a crucial message to Republican voters. It told Republicans that Trump was an acceptable candidate. This was just a normal election. That turned the election into a standard 2-party race. In the context of a so-so economy, middling presidential popularity, a standard 2-party race in the United States can go either way, and it happened to go Trump's way. So now, for the first time in more than a century, we have a sitting president with a demonstrably weak commitment to constitutional and democratic norms. Now, this is where our institutions, our Constitution, comes into play. Americans have a lot of faith in our Constitution, and for pretty good reason. We have the oldest, arguably the most successful Constitution on earth. And our system of constitutional checks and balances has, in fact, constrained many powerful, many ambitious presidents in the past. It constrained Andrew Jackson, FDR, Nixon. So why couldn't it constrain Trump? It might. But even brilliantly designed constitutions by themselves are not enough to protect a democracy. If they were, Argentina, whose constitution was nearly an exact replica of ours in the 19th century, would have been a stable democracy in the 20th century. Instead, Argentina suffered 6 military coups in the 20th century. Constitutions are not self-enacting. They don't just work automatically. They have to be reinforced by strong democratic norms or unwritten rules. In the book, we focus on 2 democratic norms in particular. One of them is what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of our partisan opponents. That means that no matter how much we may disagree with our opponents, no matter how much we may dislike our opponents, we recognize both in public and in private that they're loyal citizens who love the country just as we do, and who have an equal and legitimate right to run for office against us, and if they beat us, to govern us. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. The second norm, a little more complicated, is what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It's an act of self-restraint. It is an underutilization of one's power. Now, we don't often think about forbearance in politics, but it is absolutely vital. Think about what the U.S. president constitutionally, legally, is able to do. The president can pardon whomever she wants, whenever she wants. Any president, I'm still in some denial. Any president with a any president with a majority in Congress, can pack the Supreme Court. Don't like the ideological composition of the Supreme Court, don't like the way the court is ruling, you can pass legislation with a simple majority in Congress, expand it to 11, expand it to 13, fill it with allies. Perfectly legal. Or if a president's agenda is stalled in Congress, the president can circumvent the legislative process and make policy through presidential proclamations and executive orders. The Constitution does not explicitly prohibit such action. Or think about what Congress can do legally. Congress, the Senate, can use its constitutional right of advice and consent to block any and all of the president's picks for the cabinet, picks for the judiciary. As we know, it can prevent the president from filling Supreme Court vacancies. Congress can refuse to fund the government. It can shut the government down. And of course, it can impeach the president on virtually any grounds it chooses. My point is that politicians, if they want to, can exploit the letter of the Constitution in ways that totally eviscerate its spirit. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet calls this behavior constitutional hardball, using the letter of the law to undermine the spirit of the law. Is constitutional hardball. Look at any failing democracy, any failed democracy in the world, and you will find an abundance of constitutional hardball. Spain and Germany in the 1930s, Argentina under Perón, Venezuela under Chavez, contemporary Turkey, Hungary, Poland. Let me give you just one example from my part of the world, Latin America. Again, Argentina's constitution, its first major constitution in 1853, was explicitly modeled on the US Constitution. One study found that 2/3 of it was basically plagiarized from the US Constitution. That was not enough to stop Perón. One of the first moves that Perón made after winning the presidency in 1946 was to have Congress impeach 3 out of 5 members of the Supreme Court on grounds of malfeasance. That was a move that technically was constitutional. The Peronist Congress then passed a law making it a crime to disrespect the president. When opposition leader Ricardo Balbín, who was arrested under this new law for criticizing the president, challenged the constitutionality of this law in the Supreme Court, the packed Supreme Court upheld the law. Again, technically legal. What prevents a system, a constitutional system of checks and balances, one like ours, from being subverted by constitutional hardball is forbearance. It is a shared commitment to institutional restraint, a shared commitment to upholding the spirit of the law above and beyond the letter of the law. Another example in the United States. Think about presidential term limits in the first 150 years of our history, historically in the United States. Prior to 1951, the U.S. had no constitutional limits on presidential re-election at all. American leaders could be elected president for life, just like Hugo Chavez. But for nearly 150 years, following a precedent set by George Washington, no president sought a third term. It was not the Constitution. It was not the Constitution that prevented ambitious, popular presidents like Jefferson, Jackson, and Grant from seeking a third term. It was a norm of forbearance, of self-restraint. Take another example, the filibuster. Technically, a Senate minority can use the filibuster to obstruct every move that the majority makes. But historically, for most of our modern history, since the early 20th century, the filibuster was very rarely used in the Senate. It was treated as a procedural weapon of last resort. It was in a glass case that you broke only during emergencies. The Senate recorded an average of less than 1 filibuster a year between 1917 and 1960. In other words, senators exercised forbearance, restraint. These two norms of mutual toleration and forbearance, Danny and I call them the soft guardrails of democracy. They help to prevent what is normal, healthy political competition from spiraling into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracies in Europe in the 1930s and South America in the 1960s and 70s. Now, America was not born with these soft guardrails. It didn't always have these soft guardrails. We didn't have them in the 1790s when Federalists and Republicans treated one another as traitors, and constitutional hardball between the two parties nearly destroyed the Republic before it could even take root. And of course, we lost our guardrails in the run-up to the Civil War. In the 1850s, Southern Democrats in particular came to view the emerging Republican Party as an existential threat, as an enemy, mainly because it opposed slavery. Georgia Senator Robert Coombs, a Democrat, vowed, and I quote, to never permit this federal government to pass into the traitorous hands of the Black Republican Party. In the absence of mutual toleration, as mutual toleration evaporated in the 1850s, politics took on an anything-goes character. One historian at Yale counts 125 different acts of violence on the floor of Congress, including fistfights, canings, stabbings, people whipping out pistols in the years prior to the Civil War. Mutual toleration remained low in this country for nearly a generation after the Civil War. Republicans treated Southern Democrats as traitors, and during Reconstruction, throughout the 1870s, Southern Democrats continued to view Republicans as an existential threat, as a threat to their way of life. And the late 1860s and 1870s were replete with constitutional hardball, changes to the size of the Supreme Court, essentially court packing in 1866 and 1869, the impeachment of President Johnson in 1868, a fraudulent election in 1876. Our institutions were a mess. Norms of mutual toleration and self-restraint or forbearance only really reemerged in this country in the late 19th century. And crucially, they only reemerged after the Republican Party abandoned the goal of racial equality and allowed Southern Democrats to disenfranchise blacks and to establish Jim Crow and single-party rule in the U.S. South. Once the Republicans had backed off racial equality, Democrats stopped viewing them as an existential threat, stopped viewing them as the enemy, and the two parties came to accept one another. This is a really important point going forward. The norms of mutual toleration and forbearance that I'm going to argue served as a foundation of American democracy, the democracy that we grew up in, emerged out of a profoundly undemocratic arrangement: racial exclusion and the establishment of single-party rule in the South. I'll get back to that point. So beginning in the late 19th century, beginning a little over a century ago, norms of mutual toleration took root, and politicians from both political parties acted with forbearance. They refrained from egregious acts of constitutional hardball. So there were no more impeachments, there were no successful court packings. Senators were judicious in their use of the filibuster, they were judicious in their use of the right to advice and consent on presidential appointments. The Senate generally deferred to the president, for example, on Supreme Court nominations. Between World War I and 1960, there was less than one filibuster per year. Presidents also used forbearance. Outside of wartime, they very rarely acted unilaterally to circumvent the courts or Congress. So for more than a century, our system of checks and balances worked pretty well. But again, they worked because they were reinforced by norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. Now, we argue in the book that America's democratic norms have been unraveling for about the last quarter century. There were signs of this as early as the 1990s, early 1990s. Newt Gingrich, who became House Speaker in 1995, back in the 1980s, used to instruct his Republican allies in Congress to use terms, to self-consciously use terms like betray, anti-flag, anti-family, and traitor to describe Democrats. Gingrich was also a master of constitutional hardball. He engineered the first major government shutdown of the modern era back in 1995, and 3 years later, his allies in the House carried out a partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton, basically on a technicality. That was the first impeachment in 130 years. But the process of norm erosion really took off in the 2000s. The rise of the Tea Party movement in particular radicalized the Republican Party, encouraging Republican politicians to abandon mutual toleration. Republican leaders like Gingrich, Sarah Palin, Rudy Giuliani, Mike Huckabee told their followers again and again that President Obama did not love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans. The birther movement, including Donald Trump, went a step further, questioning whether President Obama was born in the United States, and thus challenging his very legitimacy as president. Colorado Congressman Mike Kaufman, back in, I think, 2009 or 2010, declared at one point, and I quote, "I do not know if Barack Obama was born in the United States of America, but I do know this, that in his heart, he's not an American. He's just not an American. Hillary Clinton received similar treatment. Trump repeatedly called her a criminal. Republicans chanted, "Lock her up," live on national television during their convention. Now again, America has always, always, always had an extremist fringe. That is not new. But this is not fringe politics. These were national Republican leaders. This was the party's 2012 vice presidential candidate, its 2016 presidential candidate. It was the National Republican Convention on primetime television. Leading Republicans were now denying the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals. That worries us, because in the absence of mutual toleration, when mutual toleration disappears, politicians start to abandon forbearance, and politics runs the risk of descending into an escalating spiral of constitutional hardball. When we view our partisan opponents, the other side, as the enemy, as an existential threat, as anti-American, we grow tempted to use any means necessary to stop them, right? Why not? That's exactly what is starting to happen. Politicians have started to throw forbearance to the wind. When Republicans won control of Congress in 2010, they adopted very openly, very publicly, a strategy of outright obstructionism. They basically tried to ruin Obama's presidency in order to win in 2012. Filibuster use, which is already rising, reached an all-time high. There were more filibusters during Barack Obama's second term than in all the years between World War I and the end of the Reagan presidency combined. Now, President Obama responded with constitutional hardball of his own. When Congress refused to pass immigration reform, refused to pass climate change legislation, he circumvented policy via executive decrees, via executive orders. That action is technically legal, technically constitutional, but clearly violated the spirit of the Constitution. By the end of the Obama presidency, Republicans in particular seemed willing to use any means necessary to prevent Democrats from winning. More than a dozen states, all of them controlled by Republicans, adopted strict voter ID laws aimed clearly at dampening turnout among poor non-white voters. And in North Carolina, as you probably heard, after Democrats won the governorship in 2016, the Republican legislature held a surprise session and passed a series of laws basically aimed at tilting the playing field. They packed the local election boards, they prevented the new governor from replacing Republican appointees, basically giving them tenure, and they reduced the size of the state court of appeals by 2, essentially stealing 2 court seats from the new governor. But most stunning of all during this period, at least in my view, was the U.S. Senate's decision not to allow President Obama to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by Justice Scalia's death. That move was unprecedented since 1866. All of that happened before Donald Trump became president. So the problem is not just that Americans elected a demagogue in 2016. It's that we elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy were becoming unmoored. So why the hell is this happening? We argue that what's driving norm erosion, and this is no mystery, is polarization. Republicans and Democrats have come to fear and loathe one another like at no time in modern history. In 1960, according to at least one survey, 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said they would be unhappy if their kid married somebody from another party. 4%. Today that number is 50% of Republicans. According to a recent Pew survey, 45% of Republicans, 41% of Democrats say the other party's policies threaten the nation's well-being. 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats say the other party makes them afraid. We have not seen this level of partisan fear and loathing since the end of Reconstruction. And it's not just traditional liberal and conservative polarization. People do not fear and loathe one another in this way about taxes and healthcare. They just don't. Today's partisan differences run much deeper. They're about race, religion, and way of life. Our parties have changed dramatically over the last 50 years, over our lifetimes. Back in the 1960s and early 1970s, Republican and Democratic parties differed on a bunch of issues, but culturally, demographically, they were very similar. Both parties were overwhelmingly white and Christian. 3 changes have occurred over the last half century. First of all, the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And African Americans, many of them newly enfranchised for the first time, overwhelmingly became Democrats. Secondly, starting in the 1960s, U.S. experienced a massive wave of immigration. Most of those immigrants and their kids are today in the Democratic Party. And third, since Reagan, evangelical Christians have flocked overwhelmingly to the Republican Party. So today, the parties have been sorted in a very different way. Republicans and Democrats are racially and culturally very distinct. The Democrats are basically a rainbow coalition of urban, educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities. The Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and Christian. So what? Why does that matter? It matters because white Christians are not just any group. They were once not only an electoral majority, but they used to sit unchallenged atop the country's social, economic, political, and cultural hierarchies. They filled the presidency, they filled the Congress, they filled the Supreme Court, they filled the governor's mansions, they were the pillars of local communities, they were the CEOs, they were the newscasters, they were the movie stars, they were the college professors. And crucially, they were the face of both the Democratic and Republican parties. Those days obviously are over, long gone. But losing a majority, and crucially, losing one's dominant social status can be deeply threatening. Many Republican voters, not all, but many Republican voters feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that, we think, is what ultimately is driving polarization in this country. The problem is that extreme polarization can kill a democracy. This is a major lesson from the failure of democracy in Europe in the 1930s and South America in the 1970s. When politics is so deeply polarized that each side views the other side's victory as something that's intolerable, something that's beyond the pale, democracy's in trouble. When we start to think that the other side winning an election is intolerable, we start to justify using extraordinary means to prevent it. Things like violence, election fraud, even coups. Now, Americans have not, thankfully, reached that point. But we have reached a point where, according to exit polls in 2016, 1 out of 4 Trump voters, told surveys that they believed that Donald Trump was unfit for the office of the presidency of the United States. 1 out of 4 Trump voters believed that Trump was unfit for the office of the presidency, and yet they still preferred him to the Democrats. We've reached a point where, according to Gallup polls over the last 2 years, Republicans have a much more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than they do Hillary Clinton. Those are dangerous levels of polarization. Donald Trump is a symptom of that polarization. He didn't cause it, and his departure will not put an end to it. So what can be done? I don't know. Let's be honest. Couple of things. If I knew, I'd have a much better paying job. For one, most basically, it's clear that the Republican Party has to change. It has to become a more diverse political party. As long as the Republican Party remains overwhelmingly white and Christian in a society as diverse as ours, it will always be prone to polarizing white nationalist extremism. Now, in terms of what Democrats can do, there's been a lot of talk, fair amount of talk, in progressive circles over the last year, more than 2 years, about learning how to fight like Republicans. If Republicans are going to play constitutional hardball, the argument goes, Democrats got to play tit for tat. If they don't, they'll be victims of an endless series of sucker punches, stolen Supreme Court seats, and the like. And in fact, political scientist David Ferris just published a book called It's Time to Fight Dirty. And the book argues that Democrats should self-consciously adopt a strategy of obstruction of the Trump government and what he calls procedural warfare. translated, constitutional hardball, doing things like court packing in order to build a lasting majority. And Democrats are, in fact, learning how to fight like Republicans. Earlier this year, they used a filibuster to trigger their very own first major government shutdown right out of the Newt Gingrich playbook. Some Democrats are running on a platform of impeachment this year. And if Democrats win control of the Senate, which is not that likely but possible, there's talk of denying President Trump the ability to fill any Supreme Court vacancy, just like the Republicans did to Obama. We think this is a terrible idea. If Democrats respond with constitutional hardball, it will almost certainly, almost invariably, reinforce and accelerate the process of norm erosion. In other words, it will further corrode our democratic guardrails. And in our experience studying other democracies in crisis throughout the world, that sort of escalation does not end well. Two things, though, that the Democrats can do. One is take steps to reduce inequality. Levels of income inequality today are higher than any time since before the Great Depression. Between 1975 and 2015, the bottom 40% of American society saw its income stagnate. No gains over 2 generations. For the first time ever in this country, an entire generation of Americans is growing up less well off than its parents. At the same time that 40% of our population has seen no gains over 40 years, the top 5% has seen its income nearly double. Rising inequality has created a profound sense of injustice among many Americans, and that has clearly helped to fuel racial resentment. There's no question that rising inequality and declining social mobility have contributed to both polarization and right-wing populism in this country. Democratic Party stopped talking about inequality, stopped talking about sharing the wealth in the 1990s, in the Clinton era. It should take up those issues again. Our democracy may depend on it. Another thing we can do is work to get more Americans to vote. As all of you know, turnout in American elections is abysmally low. Over the last quarter century, turnout in presidential elections has averaged 57%. Turnout in midterm elections has averaged less than 40%. In other industrialized countries, in countries like Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Belgium, South Korea, Israel, turnout averages between 75 and 85%. That is almost double turnout rates in the US. Making it easier for people to vote is not only inherently democratic, but it may help to reduce polarization. The people who vote most frequently in the last few decades are those who are most committed to one of the partisan poles. The people who stay home, the people who do not vote, are those in general who don't care very much about politics and who don't really care very much about either party. But it turns out that democracy needs those people because less committed voters have a moderating effect on elections. Now, our democratic institutions may well muddle through the Trump era. In fact, I think barring a major terrorist attack, which is what keeps me awake at night, barring that, it's quite likely that American democracy will survive the Trump era. But we cannot take American democracy for granted. It is true that no democracy even remotely as old or as wealthy as that of the United States has ever broken down. But I think it's also true that we are now in uncharted territory in at least 2 senses. One I already mentioned, levels of income inequality are reaching unprecedented levels. But we're also in new territory in a second sense. We have begun a transition as a society that, to my knowledge, no democracy has ever successfully undergone. We've begun a transition in which a previously dominant ethnic group loses its majority status. Now, we may well be the first society, the first democracy to do it. But inevitably, even in the best of cases, we're going to have to pass through a period of intense and polarizing reaction. We're living that now. During this moment of reaction and polarization, we cannot afford to be reckless with our institutions. We've got far, far too much to lose. Let me stop there. Thank you.
like to do is open it up to questions. We unfortunately don't have another microphone other than for our speaker, so.
It's good, I got like 3 of them on my.
I know, if we could only lend them out, it would be
I would
helpful.
love to. I can barely stand up.
Can we
So-
turn the AC down a little bit?
Yeah, excuse me?
Can we turn the AC down a little bit?
Yeah, Marcia, could you check downstairs? and then we'll-
Way down.
Down. We will try to do that. If you have a question, if you want to just raise your hand, stand. We'll try to repeat it so that everybody can hear it. Steve will do that for us. And we'll spend the next 15 minutes asking questions.
Why don't you choose the
Okay?
question?
In the back?
One comment, would you consider one senator voted against convicting Andrew Johnson of impeachment? Would you consider that forbearance, not of impeachment, of the trial in the Senate? I believe, so that would have been forbearance, right?
So the question is whether the bigger question is whether the impeachment of Johnson, which was a partisan affair, Republicans impeached him, was constitutional hardball. And I think it was one Republican voted against impeachment. Is that what you're saying?
I think, no, one Democrat voted against, I think it was against convicting him. I don't remember
Okay.
exactly, but John Kennedy voted out of control, cause, and courage. as
Right.
one of the characters that pointed out.
Yeah, so I don't know about that individual senator. And there's a lot of debate about whether that impeachment was, should be characterized as a case of constitutional hardball, or whether it was important and justified in the Constitution. There was a period of really intense polarization between the Republicans and the Democrats, particularly Southern Democrats, that in which both sides were really engaged in heavy-duty procedural warfare. But I don't know the history of the individual senators. I guess
Anyway, that character is a fairly interesting character you might want to follow up on.
I will.
He never, ever held any office, and he sacrificed an incredible amount with that vote. So it's worth following up. Another question is, if Bernie Sanders, for instance, had been elected, do you think would there be a populist kind of concern about where we are with the democracy? And did you have the concern even before Trump and with Obama, for instance?
So what would have happened if Sanders were elected? I think that many of the underlying problems that I pointed to, the level of polarization that has hit this country and has led to serious institutional shenanigans in North Carolina, more recently in Pennsylvania and other states, I think that would be going on no matter what. It would be the dynamic in Washington out of the White House would be very different. And I don't think, for example, Bernie Sanders does not test positive on Quinlan's litmus test. Bernie Sanders is considered populist in American political lingo because he's left of center, but his behavior is thoroughly democratic. He never encourages violence. He never treats the other side as an enemy. He's actually a procedural moderate. So the kind of acceleration of norm erosion that we're seeing under Trump, I think, would not have happened under Sanders. But the level of polarization, this underlying level of polarization that's been really building up since at least the 1990s, that would have continued. It would just have manifested itself in a different way.
Thank you. Yes.
Before my question though, did that get lowered down? It's still super freezing up here.
He turned it off.
Move to the back.
We're trying to get it. We're trying to get it resolved.
So my question has to do with the electoral college versus, you were suggesting using institutions to maintain democracy, but on the other hand, to address issues like income disparity or equality. And I'm just curious about whether you would consider it hardball to try and do away with the electoral college, since it seems that that white power majority continues to prevail against the public's will in the popular vote. And what you would think if a Democrat was elected president in 2 years with a Democratic Congress, do you think there would ever be a chance of doing that?
Okay, really good question. So would a reform of the Electoral College be what I consider that constitutional hardball, and is there any chance of that happening? I think, first of all, it's very unlikely to happen. But let me back up and say one thing. Institutional change, institutional reform is not inherently constitutional hardball. Constitutional hardball is using the existing rules to the hilt in an effort to weaken or damage your opponent. Using institutions as a weapon, pushing the letter of the law in a way that undermines its spirit. Institutions get reformed, get changed all the time, often for good. We are not advocating clinging on for dear life to every institution we've got. In fact, Americans there's a lot of value to old institutions, but Americans have an obsession with our institutions that can sometimes be, that is one, incredibly conservative, and two, can be really damaging. Most of our institutions, our electoral institutions, for example, are 18th century institutions, including the Electoral College. There have been a number of electoral reforms adopted, tried out, tested, diffused across the world over the last 2 centuries. Might be worth exploring some of them. Some of them might work better than ours, but we're very, very resistant to change. And the Electoral College, I think, is the epitome of that. So Argentina, remember how they copied our institution, our Constitution? They had an Electoral College until 1994, and finally they said, we don't need this anymore, and they got rid of it. So we're the last presidential democracy in the world with an Electoral College. The Electoral College never worked the way that our founders expected it to. It became basically a partisan electoral arena, which was not what the founders envisioned. So it's basically been kind of a pretty useless institution from the very beginning. So I'm all in favor of getting rid of the Electoral College. I don't think it would solve our problems. I mean, this is not the Republicans' fault. But the Republicans now have a huge advantage in the Electoral College. Because for most of our history, the Democrats and Republicans, again, demographically are pretty similar. Throughout most of our history, the Democrats had strength in the cities and they had strength in rural areas. And the Republicans had strength in some cities and had strength in some rural areas. Only today, only in the last 20 years, are we in a situation where the Democrats are overwhelmingly an urban party and Republicans are overwhelmingly a party of sparsely populated areas. The Senate and the Electoral College are two institutions that benefit in a big way parties who get their votes in sparsely populated areas. So there's now, through no fault of the Republicans, there are a lot of things you can blame the Republicans for, not this one. For no fault of the Republicans, they have a built-in advantage now, only recently in the Electoral College. That's a reason to get rid of it, but that's a reason why the Republicans will never agree to it, which is why you won't see change. So again, changing the rules, if it's done procedurally correctly, if it's done with a broad coalition, there's nothing wrong with reform.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, could you speak to the effect you think the recent change of people getting more politically involved in Democratic town committees and like groups like Indivisible and things like that, myself included, to become politically active for the first time? Do you think, what effect is this going to have on saving our democracy?
Great question. So do I think that people becoming more involved in local politics and Democratic Party politics and different organizations since 2016 is going to have an impact on politics? So let me step back. My colleague, Theda Skocpol, and you should look for her work, has, ever since the 2016 election, been doing a fairly intensive study in 4 communities in the heartland. I think they're in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Ohio. I may be getting one of them wrong, but she's been going regularly to visit these 4 communities in, purplish areas, fairly small town, and looking at the responses to that since the election. And she's found exactly what you said. She's found an enormous increase in political participation, particularly among one demographic, which is middle-aged, middle-class women. Middle-aged, middle-class women are becoming much, much more politically active. They are taking over local town committees. They are running for office. They are engaged in political campaigns. And Theda thinks it's going to have a massive impact. We don't know because we have yet to, other than a handful of special elections, we haven't had a major national election yet. But it's in terms of candidacies, and almost certainly in terms of who gets elected, it's changing it's changing the demographic face of our politics. I mean, we're going to see, without question, a record number of women elected. What we don't know yet is just how much more muscle this is going to give the Democratic Party. I think it'll almost certainly give some. Theda seems very optimistic that it's really going to be a whopper of an impact. I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot of talk, and some people think it's a good thing, some people think it's a bad thing. There's a lot of talk of sort of the Bernie Sanders take over the Democratic Party. And and I don't study this, so I'm going to channel Theda Scotchpole, my colleague. What she says is that's an argument being made by people who live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., and Manhattan. And what she says is, if you actually go out to most of the country, if you actually go out to most small towns across the country, it's actually a different demographic, it's a different set of people who are taking over the Democratic Party. It's those middle-aged, middle-class women, who she argues are actually much more moderate, much more pragmatic, and much, much more committed to democratic institutions than the sort of, not Sanders himself, but the Sanders wing of the party.
What is it? Could you repeat the name of the author again?
Yes, Theda. Its first name is Theda, T-H-E-D-A, and last name is Scotchpole, S-K-O-C-P-O-L.
Yes.
What do you see as the role of our other interests in this country, meaning media, big business, Wall Street? What role do they play in supporting and encouraging the polarization, the demagoguery, and that's where it seems like all the money and power lies. And I'm really curious about that, and I'm wondering how it benefits them, but the answer is that it makes money for them. And that's a real concern that I have.
So what's the role of business, Wall Street, in media in fostering all this polarization? What are they getting out of it? Are they benefiting from it? That is a hugely important question, one that I could flail around and talk for an hour about, but I'll try to answer it briefly. So there are, as my colleague Ricardo Hausman says, there are many ways to die, and there are many ways for democracies to be sick. And money in politics is one way in which democracy is sick, even apart from our polarization. Even if the Republicans became a diverse party tomorrow and we reduce polarization, the problem of money in politics would persist. Fundamentally, my answer is that that's a serious, serious problem for our democracy, because some people have so much more influence over political decision-making than average citizens that people are losing the basic sense that their vote or their citizenship matters at all. That's a huge problem for democracy. My core point here is that's not the same problem as the one, without denying it at all, it's not the same problem as the one that we are pointing to. So, there are people who argue that the Koch brothers and a set of other billionaires are actually financing this polarization. I actually don't buy that very much. There's no question that there are a set of billionaires have pushed the Republican Party to the far right on a bunch of economic issues: taxes, regulation, schools, healthcare. I've yet to see evidence that they are the ones pushing Republicans to an authoritarian right, and particularly to a nativist, racist, anti-immigrant right. That Trump ran against the Koch brothers. Trump even ran against Fox News. Trump is a product of the Republican base against the Republican establishment, against Wall Street, who aren't even particularly Republican, but he beat the Koch brothers. So I don't think that they fostered this. I think they fostered it indirectly in the following way. As we said earlier, we've reached levels of income inequality in this country that are unprecedented since the 20s. And there's no question that that facilitated by the Supreme Court decision in 2010, the unbelievable outpouring of money from a small number of people into campaigns, into Congress, has pushed economic policy to the right. It's led to a situation in which in which that 40% of the electorate perceives an extraordinary unfairness in our society in terms of who gets what. So the billionaires have created the inequality that Trump has rebelled against. I don't think the billionaires created Trump. I don't think they created the polarization directly. I don't think they benefit from it. One of the things that's going to be crucial in the months and years to come is the private sector's response to Trump. In my view, there are economic reasons and political reasons why big business should be afraid of Trump. Right? Trump is threatening the United States' place in the world. It's threatening our global trade partnerships. And more than anything else, it's threatening instability and uncertainty. Business needs a certain amount of stability to invest. What Donald Trump, more than anything else, is threatening the stability and certainty for investment. I think ultimately business has a very good reason to oppose Donald Trump. And business is split, right? Wall Street, many Wall Street folks, really rich Wall Street folks are major financiers of the Democratic Party. They weren't Trump backers, but the private sector's willingness to actively oppose Trump is going to be crucial to stopping him. If the private sector decides, like many industrialists in Germany back in the 1930s, that they can get along, maybe they can get a tax cut out of this, and they go along for the ride, we're in much more trouble. I know that only partially answered your question, but it's a big question.
Encouraging answer, though. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so somewhat related. It seems to me that the Tea Party movement that was in the 2008 with what's her name, Sarah Palin.
Yeah.
Where does the small government role? It would seem to me that is that related to? It seems to me those people, the Tea Party movement were all for small government, and now all of a sudden in for this authoritarian government, which would seem to be the antipathy of small government. How does that reconcile itself? Those strains.
It's a good question. The Republican Party has undergone. So the question is that the Tea Party movement, one of the first major radicalizing steps of the Republican Party a decade ago, was about small government, which is really in many ways very different from Trump. And you're right about that. And that points to one thing, which is that the Republican Party has undergone an extraordinary transformation in the last few years. Right? There was not a single faction in the Republican Party that was seriously anti-free trade or anti-immigrant. I mean, Pat Buchanan a little bit in I guess it was '92, right? Yeah. But basically, you did not have an enduring faction in the legislature that was protectionist or anti-immigrant in the Republican Party for decades. And now suddenly the entire party has flipped. So it's ideologically a very, very different party. Now, what happened to small government? Couple of things. Small government there's an opposition to redistribution in this country that differs from other countries in the advanced industrialized world basically because of racial differences. There are a lot of studies that show that, I'm going to broadly generalize here, working class whites who in Sweden or Austria, at least a couple decades ago, would have supported redistribution, high taxes and universal health care. In the United States, they don't. And they don't, surveys show, because they perceive that their tax money will benefit people who don't look like them. They perceive that they're, unlike Swedes in the 1970s, American workers often perceive, not even correctly, that their tax money will go and benefit people who speak Spanish or who are dark-skinned. And that is why working class whites don't tend to support there is a confluence, unlike other countries, of anti-tax, small government positions, and basically racial conservatism.
So the
And-
transition from the small government movement, they just saw
Wasn't
the
that
Trump
hard.
movement
It
as
wasn't that
a
hard.
just-
There's also a lot of evidence. There's I'm blanking on the name of the authors, but we cite it in our book. A study of a survey, survey-based study of the Tea Party activists, and it finds that that they were both pro-small government, but also racially conservative and anti-immigrant, and that many of them, many Tea Party, a huge percentage of Tea Party respondents to surveys agreed with this statement that I mentioned earlier, that the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. So there is this real, there's not that much daylight between a pro-small government position and a racially conservative position in this country.
One more question. Sir?
Just a brief question. What do you believe in the legitimacy of the quote, the deep state, the organization of business leaders, politicians, capitalists that are patriotic but are in the internals of the government? Do you think that's a legitimate theory? Why or why not?
Okay, deep state. Deep state comes out, the term deep state, the use of it, to my knowledge, comes out of Turkish politics, where you had, since early part of the 20th century, a secular military that, that was able to completely penetrate the judiciary, the bureaucracy, and the military of the Turkish state in a very secular, nationalist, anti-religious way, such that every state operative of influence in the courts, in the bureaucracy, in the military, the police, was infused with this ideology. Turkey democratizes, they elect a more Islamist political party, a more religious political party, and that party finds this state working against it, right? That's where and that was a deep state. That was real. Steve Bannon imported that to the United States. And there's nothing remotely like that in the United States. What there is, and I mean, you could call it deep state if you want, is we have a civil service in a whole bunch of branches of our government. We have people who work, who are career civil servants. So I have my best friend growing up in upstate New York, went and got a PhD, decided academics was boring, went into the State Department, worked for USAID for many years. He's a Democrat, he's pretty liberal, worked mostly in promoting democracy in Africa. And Trump gets elected, he calls me up, he says, what the hell do I do? You know, do I stay and work in this government? Or do I quit my job and my career of 30 years? What do I do? He decided to stay and become part of the deep state. But no, the point is, in the military, in the civil service, in the judiciary, tens of thousands of highly qualified professionals in diplomacy, in embassies across the world. There are hundreds of thousands of people who devote their careers to working within the professional bureaucracy. Most of them are hardworking. Most of them are capable. Most of them believe in the kind of democratic norms that I was talking about in this talk today. Most of them are not corrupt, and they do resist radical change, particularly if they view it as undermining the good of the country. So if they see,
But is that in the Oval Office level?
yeah. So you will see. So is there a plot, a coordinated plot among people in the state? The answer, absolutely not. Are there individuals in the State Department who think that the idea of abandoning the State Department and letting it rot is a bad thing? Yeah. Are there people who maybe overheard Donald Trump say something what they consider treasonous to the Russians and they leak it? Yeah, that happens too. Leaks happen. Leaks happened prior to Trump too. So you've got a professional civil service that's not appointed by Trump,
that mostly doesn't agree with Trump, that will resist, they can't openly conspire against him, but they will resist things it is. This happens in every presidency. It's more extreme here because you have a president who many smart professional people believe is doing great damage to the country. I would not characterize that as a deep state because there's no conspiracy. You have individual level actions of career civil servants. But there's a state. I mean, what Trump would like is to run the government like he ran his companies, so that he can pull every lever at every level, and get every single individual at every level in any office to do his political bidding. And this is what he said to James Comey, right? He wants their personal loyalty. Our civil service, thank God, doesn't work that way. And so if he perceives the fact that he can't do that he can't get my friend to engage in white nationalist behavior in the State Department as deep state, I don't think it's deep state.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, we have more time. Thank you.
If you're interested, the books are over here, and